baby, don't mess around, because I know that you're messing up for sure. Not trying to understand, know for sure. Hey, hey, yeah, see you. So whatever the fuck, right? I don't. You guys know me. I just do whatever. Well, it's going to be a paint session, and if any of you join in and you're listening, then don't just leave some random bullshit conversation or topics or whatever. Don't leave random comments. So anyway, okay, I got this here. I'm psyched because I'm getting a new roommate, and I think she's kind of cute. That being said, there's the painting. That's what I got to work on. That's what I got to migrate everything over to. Okay, so anyway, this particular video is some of my thoughts and possibly the playback, probably the playback of the Aarvoll JF debate. I put a link in the bottom. You guys can check it out if you want. I just got to get the whole shiz bucket put together here. Anyway, if you guys get a chance to check it out, I personally, I guess I could give you guys my summation on it. Shit, see, I got to put this closer. This is my first time. Check out this awesome new chair. All right. So anyway, these guys are arguing physicalism versus idealism, which I think is problematic out of the gate because they're like posted to each other as if they're necessary opposites, and there's no other ism they want to throw in there, like pragmatism, for example. Like it should really go for doing some pragmatism in there. Well, shit. How am I going to do this? This is your fault. This is one of your faults. Anyway, I got this. I got to work on some of this too. So you guys get to hear the bullshit while I'm going at it, and then got to try out this trusty new chair. Anyway, you guys will hear the beginning of it, but I think that at first I was like, I'm really proud of Eric for opening up that space and getting Aarvoll for opening that space. Hey, just because something, just because you've reached the limit of a thing doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to investigate this other thing. And he does kind of migrate the conversation into this particular domain where he's trying to lead this JF guy into it. And then, oddly enough, I listened to it a second time, and I thought, man, JF has great points. Mopped the floor, ended it well. And then I thought, well, I just, as per usual, I come down in the middle on these things. God. So, that being said, let's go ahead and play a little bit of this. Then I'll do periodic conversation. There's a link in there if you guys want to check it out. It's good shit, for what it's worth. And I'll start breaking out the coffee and the paint and hope my life doesn't go absolutely bonker brews doing this. So here we go. Sped up, by the way. Okay. Oh. God, I hope you guys can hear that. If anyone's listening, tell me if you can hear that. All right. Maybe I shouldn't even play this whole thing, right? Maybe this is going to be overkill in the whole thing department. All right, apropos what's so you guys watch coffee. Oh, look at Eric getting involved in that posturing of being polite to his guests first. Always watch his stuff. Very complimentary. Extra. Oh, you can't hear it at all? Dude, you can't hear it? Seriously? You can't hear the video? Or can you? Because shit, you know what? Oh, shit. You know what it is. I get it. I get it. Okay, so it's got to be played on my phone, right? Like this computer won't pick it up, so fuck. Excuse me, but thank you, dude. You totally saved my ass with that, and I know better. I know better, and I don't do it anyway, because that's the problem you get when you're like trying to be pure, and then you get some problems with it. With trying to do good by yourself and by everything, and then you think you know what's happening, and you don't know shit. Okay, let me get to YouTube. Yep. You're the guardian angel. You are, in fact, the guardian angel. Let's go to Aarvoll's here. Let's go here. And they did this little review of his debate, and he's kind of laying out his paradigm on the thing and his approach towards argumentation and what he thinks is lacking in the quest for quote unquote truth on the matter, even though I think it's fucking it's an issue. Okay, anyway, here we go. Pay attention. You have to give me feedback here, Angel. Wait, here we go. We're gonna back it up. And wait. Jesus. Okay, so hang on one sec, because I want to speed this thing up just a smidgen. Right, playback speed. That way you can dodge some of the shit. And there's some other people, there's some other people out here that are online. Winkleman. A lot of people discuss these things differently than these guys do. This is kind of a really like a grounded idea through Western descriptions of philosophy and metaphysics. But here we go. We're just going to play it. Let me know how this one goes.
My interest in this, I've moved to more evolutionary biology.
Okay.
Awesome. And your new show will start sometime next week?
Awesome. There he is.
Yes, Tuesday will be the first day of JFG tonight.
Like he doesn't care.
Awesome. Okay,
Awesome.
and I recommend the show. He always gives balanced coverage of the news and science stuff. Is in terms of biology, a lot more than I could possibly go into. Always watch his stuff.
Always watch his
stuff.
So
the last video I made, I critiqued physicalism on the basis that it introduces an whole distinction that doesn't end up making a conceptual difference. That is to say that all of the knowledge we have about the world comes from, obviously, our own mind, the way that we represent physical systems in terms of mathematical equations or representations linguistically, or the way that we kind of natively represent things mentally. Everything that we can say about the physical world boils down to, in terms of the information we can have about it, mental properties. And so the leap from all of these mental properties that we analyze the relations of and some extra mental reality is the step that I don't understand the justification for. So to start with, I would say that it appears to me that this is a form of metaphysical skepticism, where we don't want to identify what the physical is. We don't want to identify what material is in materialism. And this is a kind of gap that's left open to work around so that we don't have to address the metaphysical issue. Metaphysics being the science of essence of what things are.
Okay, so even out of the gate, he's going to start with the notion that metaphysics is about essence. I'm not going to disagree with that. I just think there's another way to also look at that word, that term, metaphysic. And he's setting the stage already. Well, you guys heard how he's setting the stage. You know, he's got these issues with the lack of the descriptive power of the physicalist. Now, the problem already out of the gate with this is like they're going to conflate materialism with physicalism. They're not going to make a parse distinction there, but it kind of doesn't matter because you know where they're going with it. There's a few things that they talk about. They're both aware of it too. This just sideline.
Physics describes the relationships that things have, that phenomena have with each other. Metaphysics is the science of essence. And so if we don't answer that question of essence,
did he, Terry?
my intention would be that we limit the kinds of claims we can make about the world, because ultimately metaphysics does connect with physics, as physicist John Wheeler famously thought, and an increasing number of physicists think as.
Okay, so now he's saying metaphysics acts with physics, and so he just defined metaphysics as essence, and essence interacts with physics. So he's already setting the ground stage of like, okay, stating there's physics, but not physical ism. You know, it's about the isms. And I don't know about how Aarvoll tore into him or thou art that, but doesn't thou art that always need to tear it into? Just think about that, right? Kidding. But here we go.
So in terms of our underworld, if we don't specify this metaphysical question, we're left with an incomplete theory overall. And my basic epistemological view, which I think that JF would agree with, is that we have to construct hypotheses on the basis of whatever information we have available, and we test these hypotheses against each other. And so in the comparison between the hypothesis of metaphysical idealism and metaphysical physicalism, because idealism specifies the metaphysics and physicalism leaves it open, idealism is the more complete system, and this gives it planetary advantage. Specifically, it helps us to resolve problems like the hard problem of consciousness and the problem of qualia. So,
okay, now and right there, I want to point out right now, okay, so Eric, I think they're not quite on the same page about the hard problem of consciousness, but it is specifically about qualia, right? But JF then migrates the term from qualia, and well, you'll see when he migrates it into here, right? But all out of the gate, there's a couple shifts that are going on. There's a couple caveats. It's more like trying to like get your ducks in a row to see how you want to argue this. But like I said, I looked at one at first. I was really happy with Eric and how he migrated through this. And then when I re-listened to it, this will be my third time, I was thinking like, holy shit, like this guy was really good. He even ends well. But, you know, they got to maintain positions. And I think, you know, Eric is doing his gig in earnest, where I'm not saying the other guy isn't, but that doesn't seem like his central drive.
I'd stop there and see what JF has to say.
Well, very interesting. So let's go through this. You seem to be claiming that materialism or physicalism, I use both terms interchangeably, so to me it's the same thing. It's just that physicalism isn't bound to a specific definition of matter. You seem to be claiming that this kind of leads to an epistemological step that is either unnecessary or extra, and that there's a kind of epistemological cost to be taking that step of affirming that matter is out there or that physical processes are out there. The first thing, the reason I don't think that this is a costly step to take is that there are several observations in the world that lead me to believe that the world will continue after my mind is gone. Jupiter, if all of humanity could be crunched under an asteroid, Jupiter would still have the gravitational effect that it has on Venus or whatever else. There's no reason for me to believe that my death will make a difference in that process, because in my empirical observations of the world, I've concluded that the laws of gravity that link Jupiter to Venus are largely independent of my existence. If you want to forget about the small gravitational effect that my body makes on structures, essentially most of these equations will continue going into effect once I'm gone. And
okay, and right here, I'm just because, you know, I'm the guy running this fucking thing. You know, I'm the one talking. See, I'm the one playing it. That's right. Even though apropos, you're my guardian angel in this particular matter. what I'm going to say is, and this is difficult for a lot of people to swallow, right? But in the most ideal sense, or mind's sense, it is like, I'm even dogmatically against saying kind of what I'm going to say in general terms, but it's worth arguing, right? That if one moves entirely in preferences, not physicalism or materialism, but an idealism, like as consciousness, like ubiquitous consciousness per se, the not mind, but the not knowing if what is not mind is also mind, right? I want to say that it is, and I've argued this before, right? Like if one, like it's overly arrogant and narcissistic to say what I'm going to say, but I do think it's worth mentioning that there is no reason to presume that. I don't want to say there's no reason to presume. I want to say there's another way to look at the scenario where when you die, the notion that anything goes on or has form or has relationship is a type of faith that you yourself are not the entire compilation, like the centroid of the entire cosmos, not only as you know it, but just in general. And so you're always observing other people's deaths. You're always observing what's going on in the world. But in one other way, you can always say, like, no, the world ends when I end, right? All relationships. I even had an argument once with Amendum about this, that he was trying to destroy logic, right? Because he wanted all humans gone, he wanted all minds, all consciousness gone, run the moon into the earth. And my notion was, and this is kind of the, I guess, anti Eric Orwell's notion of metaphysics, but as far as essences, I said, well, it takes human relationship and human language and human conception and human community in order to derive these relationships that we formulate platitudes on. And one of these dogmatic platitudes is something like, hey, we have enough empirical evidence of how everyone works that we can trust that when I die, my kids will continue to be, and that there's this other sense of being. But if one is the centroid of the entire universe in the most spiritual sense, like one-to-one with the God that is outside them as another, or something like that, then you could still say that there is reason to believe that when you do die, that the relationship between Jupiter and Mars and the gravitational pull and such is null or not the case. So once again, I'm just going to start off right there trying to underscore this argument. But
can test that hypothesis because we can see when other people around us die, and we can see that their death and the disappearance of their consciousness does not lead to a change in certain laws of the universe. So once you realize that the mind of people, and my mind and the mind of others, are contained within a limited physical space that has limited reach on the world, it's not an epistemological cost at all to be affirming that therefore there are extents into the world where my consciousness essentially has no impact at all, and these things still exist, and my consciousness may have observational access to them. It's not an epistemological cost. To the contrary, it's an epistemological necessity. If you don't want to engage with this, then you have to have a kind of narcissistic view of the world where even the effects of Jupiter on Venus are imagined in my brain and are an illusion. Now, sure, you can do that. You can do the cogito thing and say, I doubt everything else than my own existence. But then idealism doesn't find itself on any more solace in this circumstance, because idealism will lead to conclusions that are equally doubtful under the cogito. So if you want ultimate doubt about matter, you can have it, but you're also going to have ultimate doubt about everything that your mind you're at. And in the end, you're going to have found nothing about the world. You stated that we have to construct hypotheses on the basis of whatever information we have. I agree. The question is the observation that Jupiter has an effect on Venus information that I have? And I think I do. And so I cannot have an epistemological view of the world in which I ignore these things. There must be something that Jupiter is doing. There must be something out there that leads to my eyes being able to observe Jupiter. And this is what leads the idea that physicalism, that physical laws around us exist. Now, you can also get to physicalism from a totally different way. You can really start with your mind. And even if you were stuck in your mind and stuck in the kind of cogito doubt of everything, you could still realize that your mind has different components, that you can think A or you can think B. And just the fact that you may have thought B and you may have thought A when you thought B will lead you to conclude that your mind must have parts, that there must be constituents to the mind, that there must be mechanism to it, that there must be states that it's encoded in, or else the mind would have zero complexity and you couldn't possibly feel anything from it. So just from this idea, the starting point, you will still reach the conclusion that the mind must be made of something, and that something doesn't have to be a mind. And in fact, you will find in your empirical investigation of it that it's not a mind that makes up mind, it's matter, it's physical processes. You talked about idealism and metaphysics. I don't even recognize the distinction that you mentioned about metaphysics. You said that science was studying, I believe, the relationship between things, whereas metaphysics, essence, I don't have this distinction in my mind because I don't think it's real. I don't think it's a natural distinction.
Coming in okay there?
That there's something that things are, and then there are events happening to these things. It's an arbitrary distinction. To me, as a physicalist, I see the entirety of the world as a thing. Even the events that happen to things are things in and of themselves, and ultimately I don't see the difference between stating, okay, this atom is there and it's an atom, or stating, well, this wave of energy is transferring from this point to this point, therefore creating the impression of an atom existing there. To me, it's all the same thing. Ultimately, it boils down to the mathematics and how the world is, but it includes what happens in the world, including events and the energy transfers. And finally, you said that idealism resolves problems like qualia and the hard problem of consciousness. I don't think at all that idealism has a solution to the hard problem of consciousness. Idealism merely doesn't even have a mechanism for anything, as far, let alone a mechanism for qualia. The hard problem of consciousness actually is maintained under idealism. I have never heard of a viable scientific explanation of why we feel things within idealism. How is it that we feel things? I'd like you to explain that. So that will end my introduction and my response to your points.
Okay, very nice. Let's move backwards. So you start with idealism doesn't resolve the hard problem. One aspect of the hard problem opinion would be an artifact of the conceptual framework of physicalism in the first place. The hard problem is how out of non-feeling physical processes do we get the phenomena of consciousness, qualia, will, all of these things that we experience directly. How is that produced out of physical processes that don't themselves have those attributes? Well, if those physical processes essentially do have those attributes, then the origin of qualia is at least in part resolved. Where do we get feelings of pleasure and pain? Perhaps from more rudimentary feelings of attraction and repulsion that exist internally to those physical systems. So this raises the issue of the nature of physical systems.
Okay, so out of the gate. Okay, so Aarvoll's arguing or critiquing negatively in a way, or challenging the idea of physicalism, where the other guy was challenging the idea of mind, and definitely like trying to speak of it in terms of components, where that the mind is construed of that which is physical, and Eric has no problem using the term and referencing the physical, but it sounds like he preferentially trying to migrate the focus to the mind, but it's also this very particular type of thing. It's almost like Eric is also like I was just listening to this whole thing with these Jewish speakers talking about like the essence of goodness, right? That one must have conscience and be good, in order for the when God comes to like test one's soul, so to speak, or know of the soul or how high the soul is, that it would have these certain attributes of goodness, right? And then in the Jews even go so far as to say, kill the, and I forget, it was an A term, but this other type of person, meaning the evil soul, right? Actually go out of your way to kill this other person and not worry about that kind of murder because they are innately evil, right? And then the pushback, so Eric kind of takes on this Puritanism with and almost this Judeo, this Jewish approach of good and bad in one way. And I find, I entertain these ideas, but I find the adherence to it, meaning to come to the common conclusion, is not so much what's surprising. I mean, I enjoy that he has come to what I think is a common conclusion with what I think is the Judeo read of the Talmud, or where they're trying to get. But it's almost as if and I'm going to just say that it's almost as if everyone is dogmatic to their thinking, and that they're orchestrating their thoughts based on obviously a lexicon, and in this case an English lexicon down the Western philosophical field. But Eric is an idealist. I'm pretty certain he's a theist, and he holds on to certain positions. And this guy, you'll see, is, because I'm going to fucking get on with it, right? He'll challenge it, and that's what I wanted to comment on, is where and how I liked kind of how he was challenging it. Okay, back to this.
In themselves, on the one hand, reject this essence, energy distinction, the being of a thing, and the actions that it performs. But on the other hand, the way that we know physical systems is in terms of our representation, either mathematically, directly, in vision or other senses, or in other more abstract linguistic forms. And those representations are not the thing itself. It's not the physical system as it exists outside of us. And so this question of the thing in itself,
it's almost the Kantian noumena phenomena, right? He's preferencing like, hey, it's all phenomena, right? We can grand over the noumena. If you grand anything over the noumena, you got to grand over an essence to the noumena, or of that which is affecting one's internal qualia. And Eric's, his prescribed reading list probably envelops some of those basic Kantian splits, but he doesn't bring up Kant.
Essence of the physical system is left unresolved so far in your account of physicalism. Idealism is an attempt to say, in itself, that physical system, internally, subjectively, is the same thing that we are in ourselves, albeit at a much more rudimentary level in the case of basic physical systems. And then going back to your original point that Jupiter or Venus will still exist when I die, well, yes, of course, but the claim is not that the world is my representation, but the world essentially will and representation, as Schopenhauer says. So,
well, and okay, and like the whole will and representation, and the whole idea of the noumena, or the idea of representation itself, is, I mean, I almost have to fully agree with it, but the guy he's talking to kind of tries to collapse it, right? Like out of the gate. Even the idea that there is a split necessarily between one's representation of the world and the world is what's troubling. Meaning, and that's why I was like, God, these guys could come down halfway with a pragmatism wedge, right? Like, as much as Eric's going to argue against physicalism, like, oh, I'm going to just walk through this wall, which I actually asked, when I was losing my shit, and I asked Mendon, like, yeah, just bounce your head off the wall, because the next time you do it, maybe you'll slide through it, right? Maybe the atoms will split and you'll go through it. And but anyway, back to you fuckers. Let's go back here. See, every time I fucking do this, I got to retype the code and then hit this button. Sure you understand. Here we go. I got to make some headway on this damn
Jupiter,
thing.
all of the atoms in Jupiter, the molecules in Jupiter, the physical forces operating in Jupiter, internally to themselves, they have this proto-qualia aspect. Just like we feel attraction and repulsion internal to themselves, these physical systems have this kind of attraction, repulsion, pleasure, pain, the very building blocks of consciousness and qualia.
But that once, and they talk about this a little bit. Like if there was no planet named Jupiter, right, and there was like some other item, like a made-up planet, right, then you could still say that what you're referencing about the molecules in Jupiter, not instead of Jupiter, but in addition to Jupiter, right? In addition to Jupiter, he can talk about all this qualia and one's relationship to it, but the representation of the mental dialogue for items of discourse, purely items of discourse, would also then retain that sort of relationship, such as fiction affects qualia.
In things themselves. So that's why I raised this epistemological point, that we are to construct hypotheses on the basis of available select the hypothesis that has the greatest explanatory power and has the fewest epistemic costs. Physicalism, as far as I can tell, is still leaving a gap. What is a physical system? Idealism would say, in itself, it is essentially the same thing that we are. Schopenhauer would say that things boil down to a will before any higher level of representation or cognition. My claim is not that an electron thinks and is capable of formulating the cogito or something. It's that essentially what it is in itself is this raw attraction, is this raw will. And at least that's an answer. You could contend that answer, but unless you have another answer to replace that metaphysics with, idealism has the edge.
Well, okay, let's address all of this. So first, the claim that idealism resolves the hard problem, because essentially, if I understand your point correctly, you're saying that the smaller elements constituting our minds have kind of proto-minds. It may be an exaggerated form of what you said, but I think it's what you're saying. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair characterization.
So I don't think this is... Okay.
Okay, so just out of the gate, and just to cut through the chase on this, just for you guys, like he's gonna, this JF guy's gonna critique Aarvoll's proto minds, right? And then he's gonna critique proto like physical reductionism, right? So there, but it's always this like prefixed, or the notion of a proto, or some like token notion of a thing that isn't quite yet the thing, or not quite viewed as the thing.
I don't think it's a result, but it's not a solution to the hard problem, because then the hard problem has just been multiplied by 1,000. If my mind is made up of 1,000 pieces that all have how is each of these pieces experiencing qualia? You either have, you've essentially washed away the problem by denying its existence. You have delegated the problem to smaller components, and then the same problem exists for these smaller components. So in my view, this is not a solution of the hard problem of consciousness. It's a denial of it and a delegation of its burden.
Check our caddy, shit fucker. Fucking cat.
How is it that I started a discussion
Buddy.
with the guy to tell me was reducing his epistemologic cost, and now suddenly there are minds everywhere around me that didn't even need to explain. I feel a little bit like in front of the Democrat vote campaign, where actresses that are kind of disgusting start to they're nude and they're showing their boobs, and it's about naked balance. And my reaction to it was, I didn't ask to see these boobs, and I didn't ask to think that atoms had consciousness. And now I find myself with an even bigger problem, which is, how do atoms feel? How can I conceive of their mind, and how can I prove that they have a mind, and how can I see the mechanism of how this mind is generated? And this question has been buried into undiggable, unanswerable sets of assumptions. So no, I disagree that this is a solution. Now you say representations are not the thing in and of itself. I agree. But in that very statement, I believe that you are presupposing of things. Once you are acknowledging that the representations in our mind of things are not the things in and of itself, you recognize enough for me to say that you're some kind of physicalist. You are saying that our minds are merely representations or maps of the things rather than the actual thing. And the actual thing, this actual thing concept, is what physicalism is, whatever it is. You state that idealism is an attempt to say that the system in itself is the thing itself. Well, to me, that's confounding. First, the fact in physicalism, there are agents that are capable of representation because they entertain some relations with the world. And it is true that their relations is part of the world also. There's nothing special about the photons coming from an object and hitting my eyes. The eyes hadn't been there, they would just have continued their way. But they do hit my eyes, and I am a physical.
Okay, so, and right here, I mean, I'll just jump in also, because why not? Like I said, it's my fucking recording. So, there is a notion of the quanta, like quantum, like getting rid of the notion that light travels, that there's such a thing that protons travel. In a way, it's a denial of the concept of the speed of light. And I'm not going to argue that through some physics, but it's more like this idea that because we've learned that retinas are, that a proton hits it and it fires your, that particular cone or whatever in the eye in your retinas, and you get like a pixel, right? And the proton somehow like activated the chemical that allowed the firing to occur. And so, meaning, I'm just kind of pushing back on the idea, a very elementary idea that a proton is the cause of one seeing something, right? Just consider the idea that perhaps even that model is too physicalist. All right, here we go. Come on, speak, buddy, speak. Breathe, buddy, breathe.
System, and so there's no problem in the idea that a physical system could contain agents that have representations about the rest of the physical system. It may sound special to someone who hasn't thought it through, but in the end, it's not a problem that there are self-references into a physical system, because it has not been demonstrated that physicalism is in contradiction with self-reference. In fact, it is not. Pieces of a physical system can perceive and receive from other pieces of a physical system.
Yeah.
You say about Jupiter and Venus, they will exist when I die, sure. But these things internally have some kind of protoqualia. When we're down to, you haven't shown that, and you have no evidence for this, and there's no reason to believe that they have protoqualia. And even if we did believe this, we would be left with the hard problem of atom consciousness. How do atoms generate this protoqualia? How does it work? We will find ourselves with more questions than we started with. You say even that the physical world would experience pleasure or pain. No evidence for it again, and it's those are epistemic costs that you seem to discount in your method, but they are huge.
I haven't heard Eric say these arguments, but he's probably talking about some other critique.
Any such feelings. Then you talk about the physicalism. What is a physical system? Well, very good question. The answer is it will be whatever we find it to be. Physicalism is actually agnostic to what the physical system is. We could be finding tomorrow morning that we were wrong all along. Quantum fields don't exist. It was just a miscalculation. And here's what the world is made up. It's made up of purple ponies and Lego blocks. Okay, well, it's still physicalism. Even if we were made of Lego blocks, it would still be physicalism. So not a big problem that we don't know what it is, but we tend to let our physics be influenced by our discoveries and what we see about the world. And so for now, what physicalism is, it's the world is probably made of quantum fields that are oscillating, transferring energy, and showing some manifestations of their mathematical structure. That's all we can tell about it for now, and maybe we'll get further one day. But it will still be some sort of...
See, and at this point, right, all we have here is somebody that, kind of like Sean Carroll or anybody else that's a physicist, meaning of their best surmising from the information that they have, they're going to conclude some base truth on the matter. But to me, the guy even saying all of this is what we have, right? It's this ubiquitous overarching claim saying, like, in the cutting edge of philosophy and science currently, this is where we're at. And I think that's what he's saying, but he doesn't caveat it as that. He just kind of states it as the case. Always problematic.
Of elementary particle, block, or mathematics of some kind. It will be something with a behavior. And ultimately, to your question, what is a physical system? I say there's no gap at all in this view. A physical system is whatever has state and behavior. That's it. And I think that the universe has state and behavior. Then you finish with electrons, may not agito, but they have some form of proto-consciousness. Well, that's something I've already addressed. So again, it's an extension of a problem that needs no solving. It's a creation of a problem for which there is no evidence.
Now, I like that, right? Like you're going to grand over something like an electron that we don't pragmatically see, but we've come to surmise based on chemistry and based on like the whole differing scopes, like different schools or different paradigms that overlay that you can find a connection. And that's where I have to laud Eric is Aarvoll, by the way. I have to laud him, meaning appreciate the fact that he is at least attempting to wrangle with the concept from like a multidisciplinary approach that I think it itself can use an underscore because it itself, I think could be dismantled and should be not dismantled, but atomized. The concept could be reduced even more. Here we go. Hang on.
So we've never seen an atom or felt an atom, or we've never had any sign that an atom would have proto-consciousness. We don't even know by what standard. What is proto-consciousness? How do you differentiate it from consciousness? Yes. Those are questions I would ask you to clarify. And that is it for my
consciousness from consciousness. Go ahead.
Okay, so you referred to the problem of generating minds from proto-minds as expanding this need to explain the existence of consciousness, but that is begging the question because you're assuming that consciousness needs to be explained by something that is not consciousness itself. So that is presupposing materialism or physicalism, and the claim of idealism is a metaphysical claim that the nature of selves is fundamentally consciousness. Just like you would like to reduce things to some kind of ontological primitive in the form of quantum fields or something with state and behavior that's kind of not yet well defined. In a like regard, idealism sets this proto-qualia, the most basic, like reduce, well, let's do a thought experiment. Imagine that you strip away all the higher cognitive faculties that you have. You go into the most primitive kind of quasi-sensing state, and someone, meanwhile, comes up and kicks at this very vague feeling of discomfort, but that's the only thing you're qualitatively aware of. Like this sort of very basic level, most rudimentary kind of qualitative state, that is the subjective condition of all physical systems. That's the claim of idealism. And it's compatible with this notion that...
Okay, now he's saying, so now the thing is I think he's got too much Schopenhauer in because he's saying that's the thing, that's what it's reduced to. But he's putting it on feelings. Like if you are even slightly put off by somebody, that's a negative feeling because Eric's been so like pulled to the notion of will and the self that if your intuition moves you against something, that is itself something moving away from you, and if it attracts you to it, then it's something of your will or your essence or your being as a system that's drawn to it. So I want to grant over some credence to the thought, but at the same time, I'm also like,
metaphysical ultimate are quantum fields. In that, and I'm going to transfer for a moment to some empirical findings which are naturally dubious, and this is not a purely conceptual argument, but there have been models of human behavior which conform to the Schrödinger equation. Stock market movements and different sorts of decision theory have been modeled in the field of quantum cognition, and they resemble strongly the equations which govern wave function collapse. So one explanation of this, and
okay, you're going to notice he's not going to actually bring. Well,
that you recently touched on the Penrose model. One explanation is that what consciousness is a combination of entangled states in a complex configuration, and so these quantum fields represent themselves in multiple places in the physical world, and the nature of their instantiation impacts the possible evolution of that whole entangled system, whether it will decohere, however it will evolve. And the nature of consciousness in this kind of quantum cognition model would be that you stack these quantum fields together to get a complex conscious state like we experience. But in principle, by this idealist model, even the most primitive physical systems would partake of some kind of entanglement, and that basic entanglement between discrete physical objects going back to a common quantum state that is the nature of consciousness in the first place. You might think of it as these quantum fields, the internal perturbations of them would be akin to the internal feeling you have, and the interaction of multiple quantum states, of multiple wave functions combining, that produces an interference pattern, and the nature of the interference pattern would be akin to what we experience as perception. You just scale down the complexity of the human case to the case of primitive particles, but the same basic building blocks are there. And essentially, these quantum fields would be subjectively, from their own perspective, states of will, and these states of will interacting produce interference patterns, which are analogous to the perception that we have of the world. But I'm going to go through the rest of your points as well. So the problem of mind arising from proto-mind presupposes physicalism. The idea that we would need a mechanism of how the most primitive proto-qualia states would be generated, that presupposes that there's something prior to mind, which is the issue at hand that we're debating. So that's a question big. And then the idea that by saying representations of things, and I don't experience the things themselves, that you claim that that is me.
So this is the irony. If he's arguing that there's something before mind, right? Meaning that's the argument for the physical, right? Which the other guy doesn't add anything to, that Eric wants to hypothesize about. But then Eric grants over the relationship and the essence of atoms in Jupiter, right? As if to allow or subsume even that like I don't know how many probes have gone into Jupiter that you trust the probism, but I don't know. There's a few leaps being made here that I would find unintuitive, but that's why I like these guys having the conversation instead of me.
Right? Assumption, but that's clearly not the case, because it may be that, imagine you exist in a plane where there are only other people, no other objects, no inanimate matter. It's me and other people. I can, without supposing that there are, or imagine they're inanimate souls, or rather animate souls, and there's no physical control. I could represent the thought of this other being without presupposing that what I'm representing is physical. We represent each other's internal conscious states via, again, mediated representation and not direct perception of their internal condition. So the fact of representation does not presuppose that the thing in itself is material or physical as opposed to conscious. It just acknowledges that whatever the character, metaphysically speaking, of that other thing, I don't know it directly, whether that thing is in itself ideal or physical. So
right, my point on fictions.
The hard problem, you say, I'm sorry, I can't quite recall the train of thought. So I'll go ahead. See, that was my last point that I made. There's plenty there for you to address.
Yes. So it seems that you have a dichotomy in your language, which is that something can be physical as opposed to be mind-like, to be consciousness-like. I don't have this distinction. To me, something can be physical and can lead to the production of a mind. The reason I adopt this belief is that we keep seeing minds rise from physical changes in the world. Baby making, for example, seems to be a necessary step to get a mind. We haven't seen minds around us appear other than through this mechanism, and so there's no reason for me to assume
what about
that
AI?
there's a contradiction between being a mind and being a physical thing. To me, being a mind is one of the organization patterns that can be produced by physical systems that can combine states that are complex enough to lead to this. With a car, for example, that's an example I often take. Think about what leads to something being a car versus something not being a car. Well, something being a car is an assembly of various pieces that lead to some functionality that can be interpreted as an agent as being potentially carrying that agent somewhere else. So we need an engine, we need a transmission, wheels, things of that kind. And once you have these basic features made up of building blocks that are not car, you reach the car threshold, if you will, the threshold at which, okay, this thing that is made up of things that are obviously not cars, a wheel is not a car, an engine is not a car, a transmission is not a car, but put together that way, I'm going to call the whole thing a car. Consciousness is the same to me. It is not in contradiction with a physical system. It is rather a particular organization of the physical system. Now, you mentioned that I'm presupposing.
Well, okay, and right there, I'm gonna like I'll throw in this, what is a tangent paradigm on that, which a lot of people have, right? Like, okay, so he's saying the mind is developed out of the physical system, but if you take the idea that your physical system, aka your brain, your body, your world, is more of an, like that your body and your brain are more of an antenna, right? So you're presuming something physical, like energy waves, input waves, qualia waves, right? And you displace the idea that the neurons shooting the chemicals from synapse to synapse are the producer of mind, as opposed to that the mind is not generated by that. That's like a side effect. Mind is more like an ancillary effect of an antenna. Like if you looked at a radio antenna as a piece of metal, you could maybe argue that electrons, before they go down, hit the top bulb and go down into the radio. Speaking of like an old school model, that those would be those the electron skipping invites you to look at that as a mechanism, but that itself is not a mechanism. That the whole energy field yields the mind. That the matrix, the external, the quote unquote representation of Jupiter, the external world, is through and through you as an antenna, and that mind is an ancillary production, not a ex nihilo through the neurons to yield consciousness. Meaning more like we're not like minds. Yeah, it's just a distinction between not minds per se, but minds as generative as opposed to responsive. That's my side note, because neither one of them seem to at least go down that. I mean, but that's why I do these things, because it's my little input, my little world. Come on, motherfucker, talk.
Thing that consciousness needs to be explained by something non-conscious. Yeah. It's not really my presupposition, and it's not really what the presupposition is. The presupposition is that you started this whole debate by saying that you could solve the hard problem of consciousness with the idealist approach. Now here's the hard problem of consciousness as defined by Wikipedia. The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why and how we have qualia, or phenomenal experiences. And I claim that the view that you've laid has not solved this problem at all. So it's not so much my presupposition that I'm using, it's the fact that you entered this debate by claiming I have solved the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that we have qualia? Your answer is we're made of smaller parts that have qualia. And so the problem, I simply rephrase the hard problem of consciousness to say, how is it that these small parts of our mind have minds? And that's where we are left with absolutely no answer from you. So no, I do not presuppose.
See, and it is weird if they get into this argument like electrons are like proto minds, right? And it doesn't quite go that way, but it is, like Eric says, is lack of expository articulation on the matter. But I mean, this is why he did a pre-argument, and then he did the debate, and he did a post video on it, and trying to clarify things. I think they're both in overreach.
I am an agent in a world. I have figured out this world by the limits of my ability to empirically investigate it, and I've concluded that there was nothing coming to me or to even my consciousness than things that have causal structure in the world, and that from the world or be in the world. So I've concluded physicalism rather than presupposing it. And you then say that proto-minds are like someone just being kicked and being somewhere at the threshold between feeling and not feeling and being kicked. There's simply no evidence. As far as we know, the only things that can feel kicked are animals, and at best, like all animals, like insects, but at worst, maybe just humans and apes, depending on how you want to view it. But there's just no evidence that it feels like something for a car to be kicked. And so I have no reason in my representation of the world and my science of the world to include a feeling of kickness for cars, because they have not demonstrated such thing. Now, obviously, they have reactions to a kick. A car will bend, a car will move if the kick is strong enough, but there's no evidence and there's no need for an explanation of how a car would feel to be kicked, because there's no evidence that a car has feelings. And then you make a parallel between the models of human behavior and stock market movement and the fact that they resemble equations of wave function collapse. A resemblance between two things is not even an identification of a relation between two things. You could have, there's a resemblance between the successes of the American economy and the inflation X and maybe the number of sheep sold in Australia. And that wouldn't mean that there's a relation between the two. There could be just a relation of resemblance, but not a relation of causality or something to be interpreted any deeper than that.
Correlation.
And finally, you say that quantum fields make up minds, that within our mind there are building blocks that are quantum fields, and so why not attribute feelings to these things? Well, simply for the same reason we don't attribute feelings to car. It's that these building blocks, these quantum fields, no matter the particular mathematics that can represent them, doesn't matter. They have not shown properties like minds, and so we don't attribute them minds. That would be to complexify our model beyond what is necessary. I could ask to anyone who wants to give the property mind and feeling or proto-mind to anything else than an animal or something like us. I could ask, why don't you do it with cars? Aren't wheels proto-cars? Why aren't atoms proto-cars? You can see that as you do this, as you expand the attribution of a high-level property to its low-level components, that you reach a point of uselessness of the concept. If I was to say that, oh, this book is a proto-car, it's a car in becoming, it's just not been properly arranged into a car, I would totally lose the functionality of the concept of the car. And I think that you lose the functionality of the concept of minds when you extrapolate it to such things that don't need it.
Functionality of the mind.
So let's go back to the problem of that. You say minds appear only to come into being with baby making, and therefore we should suppose that this is the origin of consciousness. This is how consciousness emerges through biological processes. But that seems to miss, and I think overall there's been a misunderstanding of the nature of the analogy and this notion of a proto-qualia or something like it, to the thought experiment of reducing, stripping away all higher cognitive faculties, all the more complex representations we have. I said that if you were in this state and from someone else's perspective, they came up and kicked you, all you would feel in the most primitive kind of conscious state would be an aversion or pain. And I use that example specifically because I think that conscious states themselves exist within a kind of hierarchy. There's more complex conscious states and more primitive conscious states. And the most primitive possible conscious state is the sensation of attraction and repulsion, or pleasure and pain. And I'm not saying pleasure in the way that we perceive pleasure in a complex representational faculty, but the most basic kind of attraction and repulsion. And that's what Schopenhauer does. He equates that attraction and repulsion in physical systems to the attraction and repulsion that we experience in ourselves. And if we don't do this, then we do have a problem in explaining the origin of attraction and repulsion in biological systems. Like even single-celled organisms that don't have brains are attracted to certain things and repelled from other things. What does evolution have to act on if the building blocks of life itself are a disposition to be either attracted or repulsed by various things? And actually, if you look at the nature of a field and the nature of waves, this aligns perfectly with the idea that the most basic.
Okay, so what he's making the argument, and you know, about waves and functions and movement, but that as far as his physicalism is concerned, that the field, as it moves through you or as you move into your world, you're either doing so in a negative way or in a positive way, and that this. I don't like the self-psychometric on the matter, meaning, once again, he's appealing to will. He's going to talk about things. The other guy's going to bring it right back to the pragmatics of physics, here in a second, but
internal
that's
state
where
would
it's
be attraction or repulsion.
where
An
Eric's
or
at
any
on
field
this.
capable of hosting waves has a natural state that it is disposed to go back to, and when disturbed from this state, it has a natural gravity, the wave does, to return to its resting position. That's the whole idea of a resonator. So quantum fields themselves, subjectively, if put in a complex state that's foreign to their most basic disposition, would return to that most basic disposition. And with resonators, you can have complex geometries which produce resonant overtones at particular intervals. And so more complex organizations of quantum fields or entangled systems could have states that they would like to fall into, states that are natural for them to maintain, and then states where they're perturbed from that. And so this would be the most basic kind of building block out of which you could get evolution to act upon this mechanism of attraction and repulsion of these.
Okay, right there, just I'll just okay. In order for Eric to even bring up the idea, or even a resonator, or what he does later on, which is talk about dissonance and consonance and resonance with music as it pertains to animals enjoying it, humans or cows or something like that. And anyway, so the thing where when Eric says that a wave falls to its natural state, right? You already have to imagine almost like the analog would be like sheet music, right? Like I have sheet music right up here, right? She's reading sheet music. And so you could say that the wave or the function in the way the notes are have a particular resonance, and that they fall into that state, what he's calling the natural state, naturally, meaning that the idea of describing a wave is to say that its frequency, like how far and to what length is the note or the tone or the frequency or the resonance, the vibration carrying a particular vibe. But in order to do that, you have to frame it. Like the resonator itself has to start with some base frame. And I thought, God, that even as analogy seems as if it's pulled off of something like sheet music. This notion, this argument that waves go back to their same state, that in a way, that's like saying, well, I know what it is to exercise and then relax, and exercise and relax, or inhale and exhale. And the problem I have with Eric doing, and don't get me wrong, like this is a huge argument, part of his argument, and I really appreciate it. Actually, I think it's a great argument. But at the same time, it presumes that what is looked at is not ongoing and infinite, right? Almost like, kind of like if you're going to look at stock market tickers from the early computers to modern day computers, you're going to get possibly the same readout, but you'll get different bands, and you'll get Bollinger Bands if you're doing the stock market. You'll get retracements. You'll get all sorts of analysis on what two relational things are doing in terms of like one, let's say, currency compared to another currency. But the problem is that what I'm saying is the way in which the currencies are framed, the way in which you can pull a stock sheet market field on you can pull it out, like, oh, here's the days average, now here's the months, and let's just stretch into what the last 3 seconds look like, right? Like your optic enters it, right? And so this idea, like, it's, to me, that is promissory, that is a trust that something is going that way. It's not representative of, like, it's a trust that the sun is going to come up, in the same way that there's this trust of this argument that Eric is going to be making about dissonance and consonance and resonance and these waves. And like I said, I really actually enjoy the argument. I'm just thinking that he himself would have to articulate kind of where it itself is immutable things, to say that it fell back to where it was already presumes something. Like if I whistle Yankee Doodle today, and then next week I whistle Yankee Doodle, you can see the similarity, but by no means is the latter time me falling back to some pattern in the former time. Meaning I'm already ahead. Meaning it's not going back to that level. It's going back to a frame of what that level is. Something to that effect. I think he'd pick up probably what my specific argument is there.
Systems to build into the kind of complex attraction repulsion that we experience. That's the explanatory power. That's what I mean by this analogy between being kicked in the most basic kind of conscious state and the kinds of feelings that an electron would have. And feeling, it's a senso lato of feeling, just like Schopenhauer uses a senso lato of will. It's not the specific kinds of feelings that we have. It's the most basic rudimentary building block of it. So you state the problem, the hard problem of consciousness, as explaining why and how we have phenomena. Where does qualia come from? And the explanation for it is that qualia is fundamental. It's the most basic thing there is. Subjectively, what things are in themselves at the most basic level is qualitative. And so that's the explanatory advantage. Where does qualia come from? I would put the hard problem in a slightly different way. And I think we do have to explain how a wide variety of different physical systems, like the atoms in your hand, the atoms in your foot, and your gallbladder, and all of these various systems, how do they come into a single act of awareness or a single consciousness? That's the combination problem in bottom-up panpsychism. And I think that deserves an explanation. But at least with panpsychism, you get some kind of beginning to start from in saying that all of these various discrete physical systems, we combine them through this mechanism to produce more complex feeling systems. Now, how we go about explaining that, I already kind of alluded to with the quantum cognition models by saying that there is machinery in the brain which would allow complex geometries of entangled particles, which could act as a way to discriminate between the kinds of decoherence paths they could take, the kinds of wave function collapse it could perceive. This complex geometry of this kind of coordinated geometry of entangled systems in the microtubules of the brain would allow for a definition of
and I even like this. Like now he wants to map geometry over some sort of like ganglia of any body part, right? Like, look, we can map what's kind of going on with some sort of very complex or overly layered geometry, but that itself is projective. That itself is like a representation applied to with an assumption added to it. Like hey, I'll take my representation of a thing. I'll project another thing on it with a side cart of self interpretation on that matter. Right. And earlier, and that complements the other guy talking about components of mind, but more like in order to have a choice, like, okay, there's this choice or that choice. I can either put white on or I can put gray on. I'm making a choice. And if I can rationalize the choice, then one says, if you take that path and this path, he's going to argue, and this is the JF argument, that you're having a choice. And so by nature of having a choice, you have a component. Right, you can see what it is. You can consider what you didn't do. You can even practice what you didn't do later on. Try to reapply it. It's just it's a dense conversation. That's why I dig it. I dig this conversation. But here we go. Back to Eric.
Probability space using Born's rule. It would allow a definition of that, which is exactly that interference pattern I mentioned before, where internally the quantum state is a wave. It has a certain disposition. It's agitated in exactly the kinds of feelings that we have. That's why music, I think, resonates with us, because essentially the nature of the will is wave-like in some basic way. And so the entangled system in itself is this wave, and the way that entangled system interacts with other systems outside of it is one wave out there of entangled systems that are isolated from us yet, and then the entangled system in here. Those are two waves that interact. That creates an interference pattern, and then the complexity of perception. And why is it all brought into one conscious act? Because it's an entangled system, and that's the nature of entangled systems. Discrete physical objects that share an.
Okay, so I really like that too. I like the atomacy of it. I don't like how. I mean, it is good justification, I suppose, for the panpsychism argument, but he's basically taking something like music as a production of man, or a description of what birds do, and then he's talking about it itself, then its rhythms, and then once again he brings that through the body, right? Meaning it goes almost from a microscopic and to a macroscopic level. Like, so I don't like the fact that he enjoys the optics. It's like going to the top of a building and looking out the binoculars that they have on those mega tall buildings and having someone like sit there and fuck with the zoom on it, right? Like zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out. And that somehow, because there is a capability to zoom, that one is going to presume that music or natural dissonances and consonances bleed through one's phenomenological organism, or what they claim themselves as the self. And so in one hand I say, yeah, sure, why not do that? In another one I'm like, get your hand off of this optic. Like, quit assuming that a microscope and a telescope are necessarily echoing the same thing, right? Like, oh yeah, you can see the Fibonacci equation on the smallest molecule, and then when you look out into space, you can see it there, and therefore, that microcosm affected that macrocosm, that kind of shit. Which I mean, it has some bearing. I'm not saying it doesn't have bearing. I'm just saying it doesn't always have bearing. And in this case, it probably, like the other guy, this JF guy, he's not going there with them because he thinks it's woo-woo and theory of mind, and it's non-testable.
In explaining the hard problem of consciousness to my mind. And basically the problem is, how do you bring a multiplicity into a unity? And that's different than your example of the car, because a car, you put it together and it carries out a function that no component could carry out, but it does not bring all of these various objects and smoosh them together into a transcendent act of apperception, of self-awareness, of the multiple objects of the car being somehow in one conscious act. And by conscious act, I don't mean anything more complex than simply the presentation of multiplicity in some kind of unity. That problem, to me, is the essence of the hard problem of consciousness.
Well, and then could you talk about an android being developed like a car, where eventually, I'm wondering if Eric would always deny that the android would be component oriented and therefore not like a synthesis of, which he's making this comparison on, that cars are components that don't yield this, but humans are kind of like a summed up bag of stuff that happens to have components that yields consciousness. I'd just be curious to see where Eric would come down.
Positing the most fundamental level as being proto-conscious, or like the most basic kind of qualitative states, that gives you the ingredients, and then the mechanism of complex entangled systems gives you the capacity for these waves to interact, creating an interference pattern, which generates perception, which is still unified by the entangled state itself. So that's the mechanism. That's how my idealist model can help to explain the hard problem. And then you said resemblances between quantum cognition, in quantum cognition, between wave function equations and human decision making doesn't prove anything. Yes, of course, not on its own, but in combination with other data, we use this as one justification, or one piece of evidence to strengthen the hypothesis that essentially what we experience is subjective experience is an act of quantum computation. And let's see. I'd like to now, having addressed that, and feel free, obviously, to respond to all of those points, but one additional point that I think is raised implicitly in your characterization of physical systems is the problem of mathematical truth. So if these things are basically mathematical structures in themselves, and that's the best way we can represent quantum fields, what is mathematics under physicalism? Which mathematics real, which are not, which can be true independent observation, and which not? Under a top-down cosmopsychism, another form, we can say that all these mathematical truths are contained in a mind, and that's how they subsist. Without that kind of mind at a higher level, how do you account for mathematical truth, and what is the nature of mathematics and physicalism?
All right. How do you account for mathematical truth?
Right. And out of the gate, I'm gonna jump on here. Oh shit! Restart your device. Oh no, I'm not gonna restart the device. It's so weird that meaning when complex mathematics, or when mathematics, like if you're gonna, like, there's a difference between arithmetic and mathematics. Kitty, get down. Right, meaning the rudiments of multiplication and addition and subtraction, maybe not even so much division, you can point to items in the world and utilize those items in order to represent mathematics as a physical thing. Get down. And then the thing is like when you get to the square root of -1 or some sort of other abstracted idea, all of a sudden the mathematics has no practical link. It has no empirical link. But in order to get to that second area, you already had to have some sort of empirical, habituated practice of what one item is, right? Even the organism learning and disambiguating through focus what a thing is, like get object coherence in order to then say two of these common object coherences make two-ness. Right. And so I think that answers his question in that in one case it has to start out grounded. Mathematics starts out grounded and then it migrates to where it's self-referential in symbols, and so that's my answer to that question.
All right, so I think that this passage by Aarvoll shows us that he is ultimately a physicalist. All you have knowledge is that Aarvoll perceives the difference between the proto-minds and the minds. He clearly says he is saying the proto-mind is exactly like the mind, and in fact they have to come together to form a unique mind. Well, isn't that interesting? This is exactly what physicalism is. The idea that smaller building blocks must get together to form a whole and to form those complex entities that we see as car and as minds. Someone was noting on the regular chat, consciousness is not transcendent, and it's true. Consciousness is highly dependent on the states of the brain, and therefore it's not a truth that transcends physical truth. It's a truth that emerges from and supervenes on it. That's one of the reasons why you would adhere to an explicit physicalism. But I think that Aarvoll is a physicalist in the closet. He just is a poor physicalist in the sense that he does a poor physics work and attributes minds to these little building blocks of the universe, whereas the true scientist would just say, well, okay, they are quantum fields making up the world as we know it, making up energy as we know it, and I'm going to remain agnostic as to whether they contain anything else than this because I have no reason to think so. Now, here's a realist take on everything that Aarvoll has just been saying. Attraction and repulsion. Why is it that attraction and repulsion exist between electrons and protons, and also between male and females? Well, it's because we live in a universe with 3 dimensions, and any direction you walk in is either getting you something or further away from something. That's just the reality of a 3D world. There is no other sense in this universe for a movement to either be attractive or repulsive. There is nothing you can do that is not classifiable in between these two things. And so, of course, a lot of things in the universe end up being attractive and repulsed. It is not because of some magical link between the waves of the universe and us. It is just because everything in the universe is limited to these spatial and temporal dimensions. So as far as the bottom-up panpsychism of Aarvoll, I would say it looks very much like scientific. It looks very much like a scientist trying to find out, okay, how do these building blocks get together into a mind? Where the error is simply in this second step to say, well, these little things are minds too, when there is no evidence for it. Here's another realistic take. Music. We do not like music because we are in synchrony with the waves of the quantum world. If that was the case, shrimps are as much in synchrony with the waves of the quantum world, and yet they don't like music. Squirrels don't like music. Plants don't like music. Oh, well, I know that there's going to be a couple of vegans woo-woo going after me for this claim, but I don't think they like music. We like music because we've evolved to like music. Perhaps it's because our ancestors were finding it a good way to get everyone together, to synchronize people into synchronized group action, no matter what the reason is. Perhaps it was just a good way to display your intelligence and your degree of independence to potential sexual partners. Those are realistic hypotheses of why we like music. We don't need to be in synchrony with the waves of the universe. In fact, there's no evidence that we are, other than the fact that, yes, the quantum fields underlie all of existence around us, including us. And finally, the point of attack is what are mathematics, which proofs of mathematics can be true independent of representation, and how do you account for mathematical truths? I don't think that mathematical truths need to be accounted for. I think that mathematical truths emerge from the fact that certain statements, certain symbolic representations are coherent to each other. Other symbolic representations are incoherent to each other. And you would expect this from the fact that symbolic representations are essentially they are existing in a state space that can, in principle, contain everything. In principle, mathematical thought can contain everything, can represent everything. If there was ever a phenomenon that we encountered in the universe that we don't have the symbolic language to represent in mathematics for, we would just invent a new language, and we would invent new relationships, and we would invent new mathematical representations of it. So mathematics are always representational when done by an agent. These mathematics are not true in and of themselves. They are true under the truth verification system that we deploy in our heads. Mathematical truths are not verifiable as true when they are out there. They are only verifiable as true and only workable under an agent of some degree of cognitive complexity. And generally, we examine their truth for true proofs, which include...
I thought mathematical truths were most often provable within the same system. And he's talking about mathematics out there. I think he means it more like geometries, or the way one can discover a geometry or project a geometry and then surmise back and make a mathematical description of a thing. But anyway, I just find him peculiar.
Methods such as the demonstration ad absurdum, but other methods too. That being said, when I say that the world is made up of these mathematics, I don't really mean mathematics in the representational form. Right. The world is made out of whatever it's made out of. And it is not my claim that mathematics take physical versions no matter what they are. My claim is that whatever our mathematics say about the quantum world and what we discover of it is what the world is. And I don't mean that the representation is the world, but I mean that the world and its existence is summarized by these representations, and it is distillated by them. That's really all I mean. As far as what allows the world to exist, that I don't know, remains a mystery to me, and I think it may be a mystery of science forever, because every time you find new building blocks, the question of how did this building block come into existence? Suppose that we say, okay, quantum fields are the fundamental truth of the universe. Well, what allows these quantum fields to exist? Why aren't there other quantum fields? And no matter what it is that you provide as an answer, you will always be able to ask a further question. And there may be no final explanation, but the solution to this absence of an answer about physics in the world is the right solution to it is not so much to engage in multiplication of problems and in seeing things where they are not. It is simply in realizing that there may be such a thing as a world that's fundamentally ununderstandable. And we may left to live with the limits of our mind and say, okay, well, as far as we can see on the small scale, it's quantum field, and as far as we can see, okay, it's single universes. But this may be the limit of our reach. And there's no guarantee to a creature existing in a physical world that it will have access to the entirety of truth. It will, of course, be limited by its physical presence in the world and its physical reach, both of its actions and its perceptive tools. That's not a problem to me. It sucks, but it doesn't undermine physicalism.
Okay, well, at the end, this variety of skepticism, which is a limited skepticism, not an absolute skepticism, is the reason why I think you're rejecting the kind of idealism that I'm putting forward. And I would refer to warrants for claims and what constitutes valid evidence for a claim. I would look to epistemological holism and Quine's observations about the limits of empiricism, both verificationism and falsificationism, in that whenever we make a claim about a physical system and evidence in support of that claim, this evidence always takes place in the backdrop of other theoretical presuppositions or metaphysical presuppositions or presuppositions about the nature of logic, philosophy of math. And so all of that network of presuppositions goes into evaluating any given piece of evidence in support of a claim. So Quine would say that all truth is theory latent. Evidence doesn't stand on its own. And in response to this, we don't go... most modern philosophers of science and epistemologists don't go for like a philism in terms of epistemology and building from indubitable first principles. Instead, they constellate a whole network of presuppositions at various levels philosophically. So both philosophy of math, metaphysics, particular ontologies of physical theories, all of these various theoretical considerations bundled together as a network, as a whole, and then we evaluate competing paradigms, competing holistic theoretical frameworks. And the claim that I'm making is not that we know for sure in a foundationalist way that the inner essence of quantum fields is what we identify in ourselves as the will. That is one hypothetical postulate among a whole network of others that are brought together in my particular view of the world, which I couldn't get into the whole of it now, just as you couldn't get into all of your scientific beliefs now. But this claim is that at least in idealism, we are trying to give an answer. We have a hypothesis for the nature of physical systems in themselves. What you're articulating is a kind of promissory materialism where we don't know for sure what things are. They appear to be this, and no, that doesn't answer all the questions yet, but we know whatever it is, it's composed of states and their behavior, and it's this sort of, it's a vacuum, and that's why my last name is called physicalism. It's vacuous, because there's no clear hypothesis being put forward to work from. The scientific method might be characterized as a hypothetical deductive method, right? We put forward hypotheses and say, if this hypothesis holds, what would we expect to be the case? And by not putting forward a fundamental metaphysical hypothesis about the nature of physical systems in themselves, and that includes the nature of quantum fields in themselves, giving it a name doesn't answer the problem of the in itself of the quantum field, because again, how we know it is representational to what is in itself. By not putting forward an answer to that question, your hypothesis is lacking in some regard.
I do think Eric's quest for, when he refers to metaphysics, he's referring to essence, and he's trying to talk about the essence of physicalism and defaulting back to qualia, right? So I kind of like the idea that he's attempting to migrate the conversation from the external world to the qualia world, but the problem is if kind of like the noumena phenomena distinction, or if world is necessarily not a thing that we're going to call a thing. That's why I want to employ pragmatism and say, well, by agreement, we can talk about the material. If someone was here, they could touch this material and give me qualia about it in different ways. Like Helen Keller could still feel it. They might be able to hear it. You could see it. You could see different aspects of it to derive something of it. And yet the quest, so to say, I call it a stellation, right? Meaning that at the edge of one's qualia, when one is trying to determine the aspects of the physical world, whether it's mind or not mind, right? One is limited at the end of their phenomenological containment. That's hence the dynamics, the group dynamics of a language as a public utility kind of starts to negotiate how it is we speak about things and what it is we call these things. And yet it does in one way appear as if he wants his cake and eat it too, meaning he wants to postulate this notion of essence, like the type of essence a thing is. And then he tries to co-opt the idea of metaphysics as only an appeal to describing what things are, but it's so weird because it's such the ontological approach to saying what things are. Anyway, so I think Eric's got, like he wants to put forth an idea like, well, as I stellate to the external world, right, and I hypothesize based on, like, if this part of my, this triangle was my internal self, and then where my fingers cross is the limit to the external world, right? He wants to then utilize all of the communal data and what one can perceive as to attempt to get to what that is, hence the molecules in Jupiter. He wants to actually speak on those as far off as they are, as a thing, as an ontological referent, right? Just having an ontological referent isn't questioned. I mean, it's presumed, but he's going to say that it's more mind, it's consciousness. And I'm totally open to that idea. I don't like, I don't know. I think I'm always trying to figure out where the dogmatic fixtures are that people are trying to put forth when they're showing the chandeliers of the chattel of their philosophy, if you will.
It leaves something unexplained. And so any hypothesis whatsoever that offers a counter to that vacuum has the explanatory edge necessarily, because there's nothing opposing it. So like Popper's concept of epistemology is we have these various hypotheses and they compete against each other. And I'm saying physicalism is not really a hypothesis at all. It leaves this vacuum. And you say maybe the world is fundamentally ununderstandable. And I would say that is necessarily a useless postulate, because it may be the case that it's fundamentally ununderstandable, or it may be the case that it is understandable. And if it is the case that it's understandable, then assuming the opposite will reduce the amount of possible knowledge you could have.
And that's where
if it is fundamentally
Orwell sweeps
ununderstandable,
the
but you
fucking
assume that it is
floor with
understandable,
the other
then you don't stand to lose anything in explanatory power. And so that is a useless assumption. This form of skepticism, while I think that the claim in isolation be true that the world is fundamentally ununderstandable, that could be the case, but it's not a useful hypothesis to bring to bear for any particular theoretical framework. And so it's...
But the problem with Eric is that, like the other guy says, like people can introduce woo-woo and have it notwithstanding, claim it all the way, not get anywhere with agreement in science because it's outside of testability and it appears, like a hack job, like sawed off, fucking coming up short sort of philosophy. And Eric's busy saying, well, look, hey, if I'm going to say the essence of everything is slime green monsters, and I'm going to put that forth, it's not in contradiction to what you're saying. And, I'm going to try to figure out how that ties in. Well, that has better explanatory power. And therefore, because it has better explanatory power, it offers more than this guy where he's like, and, like trying to cut down a hard edge finally, like, hey, that's the limit of us.
And I think that's the same kind of spirit underlying your physicalism, which is, again, promissory materialism. It's the idea that when we look at it, there's going to be something there, but whatever it is, we know it's not mind. So I want to go back and address more specific points. That was just kind of broad characterization.
Can I just address before you move on to this promissory aspect of physicalism? But it's unbelievable to hear Aarvoll say that physicalism is promissory when in fact physicalism has delivered everything we know of science right now. And in fact, there's not a single idealist who has advanced anything in current science. So we have the theory of evolution to explain how living things emerge. We have the theory of quantum physics to explain the behavior of particles close a quantum threshold of energy that they can transfer. We have relativity to understand universe at the biggest scales. All of this has been advances delivered, not promised by physicalism. They are not even promised. They are just delivered. On the other hand, we have a bunch of woo-woo scientists of the mind or philosopher of minds who are saying, oh my God, I feel the quantum fields and music is putting us into the waves of the quantum fields. Nothing ever came out of it. And I'm being pointed to as the promissory. My fucking... But you can
you should read the actual opinions, metaphysically speaking, of the founders of quantum theory. Read a person like Heisenberg or Schrodinger or Bohr, and I think you would find that is not the case. Einstein was not a materialist. The founders of modern science were not materialists. They were not physicalists. So I think the general paradigm...
Their advances were done.
Look, the idea that they're not physicalists, look, you could say they're not physicalists. To say they're not physicalists would be a fucking stretch, though.
In a framing where there was physical laws, and so whatever they discovered was not idealism. They may have been idealists in the closet, but they have used work that is one of physicalism. They've identified the building blocks of the universe.
The method is the
I disagree with that. I disagree with that too, because I mean, they're talking about relational forms, and they're not trying to say of something. They're abstracting it, talking about a frame. Like a lot of relativism and a lot of these other things, they're using objects of discourse or mathematical objects that are not necessarily in representation to like, okay, well, if we're going to define relativity in terms of frame relations relative to speed of light and so forth, there are no train cars going through space, that if this guy was correct, he would say, well, relativity defined in terms of light in different relational train carts moving at different speeds to one another and to themselves, and that's got a physical representation in the world. That's obviously being correct. I have to agree with Eric at that point. So this guy, the JF guy, is reducing heavy on that, meaning not reducing heavy. He's coming down heavy on that, and he's drinking his drink there in this video, showing that he's kind of proud of it. I mean, both these guys should be proud. This is a great video. You guys actually produced some good shit.
That method, the idea that there are regularities, there are laws in reality, is not unique to physicalism. There are plenty of varieties of idealism which provide that exact same nomological framework and also give justification for that epistemological methodology. And I would say that idealism gives a more robust justification for both the methodology and as well the existence of laws, persistent regularities across time and space. But let's go back to these specific concerns. So you say that I'm a closet materialist because I'm referencing that complex minds are built out of simple minds, and that this is the idea of the building block, and that is essentially what physicalism is. But that's not physicalism. That's just, I mean, essentially that's the principle of sufficient reason. The idea that for any structure, there is some reason why it is the way it is. And so that's the principle that complex things are, we can reduce them to simpler things down to the most simple thing. That is consistent with idealism. Platonism is the classic example of a variety of idealism, which engages in this kind of reduction of building blocks down to or up to the most simple thing, which is the one in Platonism. But so that's unique to physicalism, that the idea that things, complex things, reduce to simpler things. The idea that they're a mind, that is an explanation for the origin of qualia, by saying that the most basic kind of qualia, raw attraction and repulsion, is the building block of all higher level qualia. And so you explain the existence of attraction and repulsion by the kind of geometry of space, just the fact that any two objects closer together or further from each other, but that does not explain the existence of attraction and repulsion, or the persistent tendency for two objects with particular dispositions to move towards each other.
Okay, now he says objects, and he's going to talk about two particular objects with these dispositions, right? And you could talk about, let's say, dust flying above a fire, right? And you could say the disposition of the dust above the fire moves in these particular ways, and then it makes sense. But if you're talking about disposition as a conscious action, that one disposes oneself or holds a disposition, a non-position relative, but that the disposition itself takes on a type of regularity, right? That would be something else. And so, so what Eric's statement leads you to have to believe is that there is, in fact, a type of persistence that he's stating that there is. But what it is he's referencing about what it is that is persistent is the problem, and that's why I also critique the idea of the resonator and what is considered standard to talk about a wave falling back to itself, or one having a disposition towards some other entity or item, right? When he's not even making a distinction between humans, let's say, and objects, but maybe he doesn't need to in this case.
Each other or away from each other. The fact that they do incidentally move closer together or further apart doesn't explain the existence of that persistent tendency for them to do so. And then,
and here I'm not. God, see, it's so difficult. Like to say that water puts out fire and then has a persistent tendency to do that would qualify with what Eric's saying, but the way Eric's phrasing it, it's almost as if he's trying to overextend the application.
You say that little minds are things too. My hypothesis that little things are also minds. There's no evidence for this. Again, bear that in mind in the context of epistemological holism. It may not be that we have firm foundationalist justification for that claim in isolation, but in the context of a broader theoretical framework, it gives us some explanatory power, in that we can explain where these most rudimentary qualia come from by saying that they are fundamental, and it's built into the nature of wave dynamics, in that a wave necessarily, when agitated, wants to return in condition. And we can think of that externally, the nature of that wave, in terms of space and dynamics of physical systems. But internally, the claim is that what we're observing as these wave functions, these waveforms, is the same thing that we feel in ourselves as our disposition of will.
Yeah.
And let's see.
So that's what I mean.
I think it's not the case.
So once again, if you talk about the water, water's disposition to put out fire or something like that, and then you immediately, once again, it's almost too much of a huger diet. Eric's bitten off too much of the plate of Schopenhauer, as he wants to like go at everything again from that Schopenhauerian Wheelian. Anyway, I hope you guys see what the distinction I'm making between Eric's desire to preference personism as a greater optic, like one's disposition as feeling sense, kind of conflated against the way you might refer to object disposition, right? Or in his case, he might have to say, oh yeah, the water has a disposition relative to the fire when the fire's under it to put it out or something like that. And then it tends to always do that, right? But he did be looking at single serving examples here, but then saying, well, the pattern of it is the pattern and it's the wave, and that wave somehow on a microscopic or a personal level translates to individuals' will.
And other animals don't like music. And I think you're glossing over the existence of laws governing music theory. If you play dissonant, and we can, objectively measure whether a progression is dissonant or consonant, and not just at the level of kind of the acoustics of the simultaneous sound waves, but in the harmonic progression, whether we introduce tones that are foreign to the tonality in question. All of those complex music theoretic regularities go into not whether humans enjoy the sounds, but whether other animals. So you can play Stockhausen for a bunch of cows, and they generally won't come listen to it. But you could play, I've seen videos on YouTube of trombone players going out and playing some melody, and it's consonant, and it sounds good, and all the cows come out. If you go out, I assume you don't play the trombone.
But there's no accounting for taste. I mean, if you listen to whales crying and find it resonant and beautiful, I might find it dissonant and perturbing. And we're both humans, and so the idea that there's not a variable difference is problematic in his argument here. But the guy retorts this.
Went out with a trombone and tried to blast one for the cows. I'm going to say they're not going to come to you. So there's something more fundamental about music theory, and the Pythagoreans obviously thought this was important. There's something fundamental about music theory and wave mechanics, which maps onto physical processing, and which resonates deeply with all life, and not even just life, but inanimate matter. If you've looked at any of these experiments in cymatics, you can look at the kinds of geometric forms that come out of exposing various different sorts of sound waves, and the more consonant sound waves produce these geometrical regular, beautiful structures that the natural world resonates with sound in a fundamental way. And I think that's because, as far as our current physical description goes, things are made up of these sorts of waveforms, wave patterns.
I see, and Sean Carroll, basically, that head physicist guy, he says, look, if you want to argue between the wave and the particle, the wave won, right? And so if Eric's going to start with the premise of the wave, then it's about the quality of how the waves move amongst and with each other. But the idea that one would be attracted to a resonant pattern that would yield let's say a geometry like the sands, like a sand dish inside of the pyramids that under certain weather, under certain cosmological situations generates, or earth movements would generate a geometric patterns in the sand, right? Or in water, or in the way ice is frozen or whatnot. That doesn't mean that pattern, by virtue of having some nice form geometry, is necessarily conducive or aesthetically read by an organism. Well, once again, like the variability seems so pluralized, so to bear down on that almost is more of saying, well, we know that Eric has an affection towards these music, so kind of like I might bring up art because I have my own affection towards it. He has this towards music, so he might want to be introducing it. Plus the whole idea of the Hilbert space. the idea that you got this, you can develop whole functional ranges of geometries within basically like three-dimensional infinites or grand finites, such that you can still generate like whole objects and calculuses within that, and that those kind of are how to put it, like I think like to talk about wave functions in this idea of a Hilbert space is like kind of a representation that one can develop. But that wasn't the point of where I was going with that. The point was a preference to look at, and kind of like I said, Eric's kind of trying to make his argument from a multidisciplinary approach, kind of like the way it's either, I think it's Eric Weinstein, or maybe it's Brett. I think it's Eric Weinstein, the older math brother that's going around. He has tried to develop this multi-layered, multi-group, mixing quantum with string theory, and string theory with all these other mathematical established ideas, to pull them all together in a kind of a unified thing, right? Like Langen's, like a comprehensive model of the universe, where they're using multivarious differences of things to bond them together and then find the common outline of them. And I think so that's why it's like I appreciate the general appeal that Eric has. I still think it's not like I don't think Eric spends a lot of time trying to dismantle his own arguments or find out how they're possibly not good. Like, he's preferring like more viewers and more patrons and more of like a, hey, do they like me as I am now? And but it's not that he's not investigative in his thoughts and philosophy. It's that he, like the other guy, have kind of settled on a type kind of adherence or view, and it's almost developing a dogmatism out of Eric now. We'll see its future reiterations.
And then your explanation of math, I think, doesn't give explanatory power for why math works to describe the world, why we discover mathematical systems first and then identify these same structures in nature later. It's not the case that math developed by accounting for the regularities in the physical world through our, it's the case that math goes well ahead of empirical science. And then, like, the idea of Hilbert space was invented before quantum theory. And then they found that, hey, this Hilbert space idea is pretty useful in explaining the existence of quantum states and characterizing them in their relations. So I think your account does not have explanatory power in that regard. And I think the alternative, that math is true whether or not we use truth verification procedures upon it, has the advantage in terms of explanation, in that we can say why these mathematical structures that we discover mathematically equal systems, because the true mathematical structures have something about them that is real, where the false mathematical structures have something about them which is not real. And the reality or the unreality of mathematical structures is not determined by us in our observation. And I think that Gödel incompleteness points that way.
Well, that's the idea, that you're discovering math. I was gonna, heck yeah, what to say on that? Let me see. I'm just gonna see if I can back that up just a smidgen. Come on. I don't want to go too far at all. Actually, I just wanted to.
Because the whole point of Gödel incompleteness is that under that and other mathematical systems.
Okay, hang on.
That math goes well ahead of empirical science. And then, like, the idea of Hilbert space was invented before quantum theory. And then they found that, hey, this Hilbert space idea is pretty useful in explaining the existence of quantum states and characterizing them in their relations. So I think your account does not have explanatory power in that regard.
All right, now one thing that I would like Eric to stand back from, right, as he's arguing idealism and talking about resonances and dissonances and talking about this idea that math is somehow ex parte, the individuals performing the math of the consciousness. It's that whole like objectification of an ideal math form, which I'm not going to argue against. I'm just not going to argue for it because I think it comes up short. But Eric should hopefully, as he's like culminating more interviews and more time, and I know he's more than capable of doing it now, as he's able to probably express it. But you could say that this very argument is a like kind type of like that JF is an antagonistic energy that is relegating a type of dissonance relative to him, to Aarvoll, right? And that you could look at these two as wave functions. You could even look back on himself, disparty himself, if that's a word, right? Like look at himself objectively through his own interviews, like just looking back upon himself, but with losing the idea that who he's listening to is himself, right? So it's very difficult to look at one's own recording and go, was that me? God, that doesn't sound like me, right? I mean, I'm not going to say it's difficult to do it, meaning it's easier to, have spiccato relationships with one's identity online, but I'm just saying if you objectified it and he looked at him as a mind, JF as a mind, and himself historically as a mind, no matter how recently he looks at the video, he could find that even his quest in the fight for whatever his position is generative of some, and I don't think he would say geometry or mathematical form, but it could be characterized as such. It could be characterized as dissonant patterns that arise like a stock market ticker to have some sort of relational agreement and disagreement. And I just don't know whether or not he likes to characterize his own self back to himself.
And I think the alternative, that math is true whether or not we
like
use truth verification procedures upon it,
quest for
has
proper
the advantage
description
in terms of explanation, in that we can say why these mathematical structures that we discover mathematically equal systems, because the true mathematical structures have something about them that is real, where the
So once again, if you looked at yourself relative to him as some sort of geometry, that when at this point, Eric, this appeal for truth, right, as opposed to saying a good description of the matter is the best approximation for truth. I'll just say truth, and people just throw this word, this big old word, truth, all around as if it's known. It's like known when you agree, and it's not known when you disagree. It's not known when someone else sees coherence or something that you're incapable of seeing. It's not true if somebody has a reference of correspondence and you don't have that reference of correspondence. And so it does feel almost like it's moving into
false mathematical structures have something about them which is not real. And the reality or the unreality of mathematical structures is not determined by us in our observation. And I think that Gödel incompleteness points that way, because the whole point of Gödel incompleteness is that under that, and other mathematical systems mirror it, but under Gödel numbering applied to the Principia Mathematica system, we can make claims about the system using this Gödel numbering representation, which can't be formally demonstrated, and yet which we can know are true. And so there's no truth verification procedure, or at least no formalized one, and yet we can know that they're true. There's something about the math that transcends our capacity to formalize it. And then, so you're saying whatever the world is made up of,
I don't think
that's basically your physicalism, made up of whatever it's made up of, and it's a question mark. It's a vacuum. And I think giving an answer is better than not giving an answer. And that's where I'll leave my response for now.
So I like that.
All right. Well, I'm ready for the conclusion because I've said what I have to say. Now, the idea that my physicalism is a big question mark is absolutely ludicrous. I have a bigger understanding of the world as a physicalist than any of those clowns who are coming and seeing minds everywhere where there are none. These people will not inform you about how life emerged, about what happened 4 billion years ago. And so the idea that I put a question mark is absolutely ridiculous. I put a question mark in the sense that what I'm saying is if we were all wrong with current science, we could replace with a new science tomorrow, and it would still be physicalism. It would just be another physics. That being said, I'm extremely confident in the current form of physics and biology.
Of course you are.
That we've developed.
Well
as far as music, of course, music is waves in the physical universe. So of course it has consequences on anything that meets up these waves, that gets bounced around. It's not necessarily, first I've not stated that animals do not like music. I said animals do like music, but plants don't like music. Or if you want to get down to, oh, maybe plants like music, then rocks don't like music. There must be some things that don't like music in this freaking universe, because even the likeness of music and the feeling of liking it must be ultimately underlined by something that doesn't like stuff. The same process I've done with proto-minds. And then you say that my attraction and repulsion example doesn't explain the persistence of attraction and repulsion. Well, the persistence of attraction and repulsion, for example, between an electron and a proton, is a persistence that is due to the stability of the laws of physics in our epoch. Electrons have been attracted through protons as long as we were in the energy reverse that allowed the electromagnetic field to be in operation and to act in the way it acted in our universes. Perhaps it wasn't the same at the beginning of the Big Bang. Perhaps it has evolved with time. Perhaps there will be a time at which the electromagnetic field in the universe will become meaningless. But those are the responses of science. Those are already extensively more detailed than anything that we can hear from an idealist. And I will conclude by saying, look, my view of the world is not demonstrated today to be contradictory. I'm born as an agent in the world. I've used those. I have tried to go as far as those limits allowed to interact with the world, and what I found was a world made up of atoms, masses, gravitational attraction, electromagnetic field.
It's okay if someone says they're an agent of the world, but to believe that you're an agent of the world, that to me is like an inherited, conditioned response. And I know, I'll just say that because fuck it. I like to say
and then I looked into my own brain and the brain of others, and I found that all of my feelings and all of the processes that I applied to the world were caused by things that could be in my brain, that could be changed by drugs, that could be stopped by brain damage. And so I had to conclude along the way that our minds are just a piece of a bigger universe, and this bigger universe is made of other things. And that is essentially physicalism. It is that these other things not only formed my mind, but they formed also the things around us that are perceivable by my mind. There is no problem with it. It's simply that the universe is a physical system that is self-referential. It is not an interrogation mark. We are in the universe, and we are observing the universe and observing ourselves. Self-reference is not a contradiction. It is simply the state in which we came into this world, and I'm satisfied that this is the truth about the world. And that is my conclusion for today.
Okay, great, JF. Thank you for coming on. Let me just respond really quick to a couple things. The idea that there must be things that don't like music because there are things that do just illustrates the basic presupposition underlying physicalism, that because there is consciousness, there has to be something that's not consciousness underlying it. That misses the point that we're explaining complexity in terms of a reduction to simplicity, but we're not necessarily explaining it in terms of a dependence upon something ontologically distinct, where, you know, physical systems that are not mental, there's a claim about the essence of those things. They are not mind. There's something else we can't quite define, but they're not mind. And that step is auxiliary to the explanatory power of any physicalist hypothesis. It doesn't do anything in actually explaining the world. All it does is say, it brackets a class of hypotheses, but doesn't actually explain anything itself. And then the idea that the laws of physics account for attraction, the stability of those laws is the case, but I think my explanation for the existence of attraction is having its roots in the nature of resonators, the nature of fields, and the nature of wave propagation. The fact that they do want to return to some kind of stable condition gives some kind of account for the stability of those laws and gives those laws some kind of origin, which is all, again, related to the problem of music. And I would acknowledge for sure that your worldview is not contradictory, and it's capable of producing a lot of explanatory power, but it is caught in this kind of skeptical, island or something where it can't go beyond a certain threshold. You can't answer certain metaphysical questions. You can't even really try to, and you can't explain the existence of physical themselves, the existence of mathematical truth in itself, I would argue. And so basically your worldview is limited necessarily, and you might view that as a virtue. I'm not sure why it would be a virtue, because again, my basic epistemological view is that we have whole frameworks on the basis of whatever data we can put together. We want them to be coherent. We don't want internal contradictions, but we want greater explanatory power. And I think with that is an invitation for metaphysical risk of positing something that we don't know for sure, but it might be true, and it's worth pursuing some of these lines of thought. So even if you don't become an idealist today, maybe you'll pursue some of these lines of thought and, I don't know, give the Penrose-Hameroff model another look and consider these things, because I think it's not as simple as woo-woo science on the one hand, who's physicalist, empiricism on the other. It's probably more complex than all that. But again, thank you for coming on, JF. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. I'll go back to my island, and you can stay in the mainland, taking all of your epistemological risks. I'm not interested. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
So, okay, so that's the end of it. And I guess my last bit of commentary on it was I really did like that end. Like, to say that he's on an island and that he can't reach beyond it. Once again, it's that like stellation at a limit that Eric so badly wants to like bring about, like do an archaeology of the way other people were questing for essence. And then there's the whole reduction, proto-minds or proto-materialism or proto-something or a description of something, where then Eric appeals to the waves and movement and then tries to talk about the movement itself having relational dispositions to it. And I'm okay to that. But this other guy is just saying, look, yeah, I will stay on my island, and you take these epistemological experiments with you, take your shit and get out, is kind of the idea. And so the thing about Eric, though, is that, like, ultimately there, and I agree with this, that there's this thrush of towards godness, or towards this kind of what I would want to say is like a vapor fluorescent, not a magnetism, but like an ideal opening that allows one to go beyond the scope of their articulation, let alone, I mean, first you have to go beyond the scope of your ground, your belief in your ground of your world, right? And then get to God. And that to quest for essence is a quest for God. And this whole idea of repulsion and attraction, like I mentioned earlier, has a lot more to do with, I think, probably Eric's and or other people's notion of general ideal good and bad, but interpreted on gut instinct or thought instinct. Like, oh, that person looks shabby, therefore I'm going to stand back from them. They're less appealing. Or, oh, that person doesn't smell, they smell great, so I'm going to move towards them. Or some sort of, once again, an appeal to a greater macrocosm of one's phenomenological attractive domain as an organism, and then to use music and vibration as kind of this bridge that then somehow states something more about the essence of something, where then both of them believe they're more like the one guy's found truth in a stopgap, JF has, where Eric wants further discussion. He believes importing further hypotheses to get further into or towards what essence is a thing. And perhaps that's why I brought up the whole notion of the Kabbalah as a type kind of orthodox ground that either Eric has tangentially or Western philosophy has just come to, because they are both approximating this truth in the world, right? And that somehow one's conscience knows what is good and what is bad in all cases, such as, like the fact that I didn't break out my coffee this whole fucking time after I brewed it. So I'm going to do that now. But anyway, the whole point is that coffee by its very nature is bitter. And so the idea of sophisticated tastes of coffee or scotch or anything that would be, let's say, repulsive to an infant or a child that was given too much cotton candy is somehow both, like, oh, we gave them too much cotton candy, therefore they don't like coffee. Instead of saying, well, no, coffee is intuitively against the human organism's consciousness, therefore it's evil, right? And you could take on something like that ethos, like you shouldn't smoke cigarettes because when you park running cars in cow fields, the cows don't run up and start sucking on tailpipes. And they don't do it because they don't like it. And somehow that has to do with, on a microcosm, like the fact that some of my hairs on my arms like to flip in one direction and settle there relative to some wind. And they're persistent in wanting to, settle in a particular relationship to the body. Then knowing that the follicles shift also in different things, so that their relationship is already different and to the body. The idea of persistence itself, right? It's like Dali's Persistence of Memory painting, right? All melted and goopy, like that your memory itself, or this notion of persistence, it has application, obviously, and it has use, but when it itself, persistence, is idealized, and I think that's where I'm on a different page from. I'm on both their pages in a way, but I'm not on Eric's page in that I don't idealize his idealism, and I do think that what would have benefited these two, once again, to just circle back 2 hours later, would have been to note where pragmatics come in, because Eric is in a quest for qualia as a philosophical drive, but once again, you can't see the atom, you can't see inside of Jupiter. You've already agreed to the grounds or the limits of your qualia state. You're trying to get at the essence of particulates or wave function, but at the same time, it's like at some point you have you have to bring your world back to the pragmatic activity. You still wipe your ass, but Eric's not like, well, I feel better without a wiped ass, so I'm just going to not wipe my ass. No, he's going to wipe his ass, and it's not like, well, I'm putting the ass back in its most dispositioned state or something like that. Not to do ass talk. But anyway, the point is that they both did great. I disagree with them both. I think they could have bridged it differently than they did, but as it stands as an argument piece, if you guys listen to it, I think it's pretty crisp, and I like both their last end words. And that being said, thanks for the last person that just popped on to look. Hi Mom. Hi everybody. Thanks for watching. Just have this coffee here real quick. And then I'll do this little shimmy. My baby don't mess around because I love her so, and this I know for sure. Hooah! And I'm the mini one.